In this video, we're going to talk about Jira Timelines and Jira Plans. So let's go ahead and head over to Jira and I'll show you how to set up a timeline for a project. Here in Jira, go ahead and navigate to whatever project you want to create a timeline for. On the widget on the left-hand side, go ahead and select Timeline. If you do not see Timeline, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go to your board. You're going to have to go to Configure Board, and under Board Configuration Settings, you can have a toggle that says Timeline and go ahead and enable that timeline. But here we already have Timeline enabled, and here you can see this is the page that's automatically pulled up. Now there are a few different things that you can do. First of all, you'll see that all of the epics I have in this Development 2.0 project are shown here on the left-hand side. And here you can see I have some different bars here. What you can do with these different bars is you can click and you can drag start dates and to-do dates for these different tasks. And so this is how you can really set a timeline and create a nice visual for whatever project that you're looking for, is by clicking and dragging. And so if one doesn't have a bar, when you hover over something that doesn't have a bar, you can click and create it. And from here you can click and drag those different bars for your projects. Here you can see on the bottom left-hand side, you can change the view of your timeline. So if you just wanted to view your timeline in weeks and you wanted a more weekly view on what's upcoming and the next milestones that are upcoming, you can definitely do that. You can have it in the months view, which shows that just in months, or you can show it in quarters if you have a really long timeline and you want to see what it looks like over the next 12 months. I personally like the weeks or the months view. The weeks view really just helps you focus on what's coming up this week, next week, and the following week. Months view is also helpful as well, but the weeks view really does help you click and drag and control those start dates and complete dates a little bit closer on this timeline view. The other thing you can do is you have view settings up here. So let's say you want to show things that are completed, or maybe you want to hide things that are completed. You can toggle that, and as you can see, anything that I had completed there just dropped off. I personally like seeing the progress that my team has made and showing the progress that my team has made on a timeline, so I usually keep that toggled on. You can also choose whether you want to show things that are completed within the last 12 months, 9 months, 6 months, 3 months, or 1 month. Here you can also choose to expand all epics or collapse all epics. I usually have them collapsed. You can also highlight and show whether or not you want to highlight dependencies and use dependencies, progress, releases, or warnings as well, if you want warnings to be displayed. Now, one thing that you can do when you want to highlight dependencies and do dependency mapping is if you hover over one of the bars that you've set, you'll see this link icon. You can click that link icon and you can drag it and you can connect it to another bar. And here you can see that that maps a dependency within this project timeline, and you can do the same thing here. So maybe this is a dependency mapping here. And so here we can go, yep, map dependencies, and maybe from here we also map a dependency to this epic. And this is just a really nice way that you can do dependency mapping and show that within your timeline. And so when you go into a later view and a month's view, that's really what this can look like. The other thing you can do is you can have this epic drop down, so you can select which epics you want to view. You can select what issue types you want to view. If you have quick filters for your board, this is where, or your backlog, this is where those quick filters will show up. So anything on the timeline that you select from this left-hand widget will also correlate and coincide with your backlog view and any boards that you have. So any quick filters you have for your board configuration, this timeline will match that board configuration. The other thing you can do is you can hit the ellipses icon in the top right hand corner and you can go to configure timeline. This is the board configuration where the timeline aspect is listed here. So this is where you would toggle to enable that timeline, which I mentioned earlier. You can include child level issues. Again, I have that toggled, or you can choose to have the schedule by sprint dates or by start and due dates. Again, I like choosing schedule by start and due dates so that I can control where those different epics start and stop. Whereas if you choose schedule by sprint dates, then it really just means you need to plan your sprints out for the entire project, which might not be feasible. You might just be looking 1 or 2 sprints ahead at the time, since the idea is to be agile and not focus on everything in more of a waterfall standpoint. So we're going to go back to the board, and this takes you back to the board because, again, we were in the board configuration, but if you go back to timeline, we're right back to the timeline that we had previously created. This is a really nice visual for clients or for team meetings or reporting to senior leadership to show where you are, what progress your team has made on the schedule, and whether or not you're on track or you're falling behind. The other thing that you can do is you can actually export this view. And so if you wanted to send the timeline and the progress that you made to the client, you can hit export, and you can either export this as a spreadsheet or as an image. I prefer the image. It's just really nice. You'll have to mess with the format with the spreadsheet, but just being able to attach an image to a report for your client or for senior leadership is super helpful if you're not going to be the one actually pulling up Jira and displaying it to them. So that's one thing that's really helpful with the timeline feature. So again, the timeline here on the left-hand side does align with the backlog and the boards that you have created for your project. And so we'll share those quick filters here. The reason that it's so important that I called that out is because there's this other portion in Jira on the navigation bar called plans. This is where you can create more timelines and more roadmaps and more plans for your project. And these plans actually have a little bit more functionality than the timeline that is listed here. And so I definitely wanted to cover this timeline and show you how it ties into your board and your backlog, but I also want to show you plans as well. So if you hit the plans dropdown, you can either view all plans, similar to view all filters or view all dashboards. You can create a plan. What we're going to do here is we are going to create a plan. So go ahead and hit create plan. This is where you're going to name the plan. So I'm going to call it an implementation project plan. Access, this is where you can have it private or you can have it open. So this is where you restrict access. So add work to your plan for my board or for my project. I'm going to include a project, and I'm going to do the development 2.0 project, and the team is optional, but here you can add more work. So if you wanted to add multiple projects for this plan, this is where you can pull in multiple projects for the plan. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it with this one development project. So go ahead and hit create. And here you can see we are under the implementation project plan. We have a timeline, we have a calendar, we have teams, releases, and dependencies on the left-hand side, and we also have plan settings on the left-hand side as well. The other thing I want to call out here is that there are some unsaved changes buttons here. Anything that you do in a project plan, if you have start date or due date, or you change the assignee on something in a plan in a priority, if you publish those changes are going to get pushed into Jira. And so you could be reassigning things to someone else in Jira if you save and you publish those changes. I think plans is incredibly useful. I love the additional functionality that plans has versus just the timeline view, but it should only be used as a rough draft and as a plan. And what I mean by that is, do not publish your changes. In my opinion, I would not hit the publish changes button on any plan because you could be altering data and information in Jira that your teammates are using to work off of. That's something that I really, really want to stress. You can choose which changes you want to publish to Jira, but those changes can get quite extensive, especially if you are just drafting a Schedule A or a Schedule B if something doesn't go as planned. And so that's why I say plans are super awesome. They're very functional. They're very dynamic. I really like them, but they can also be very dangerous if you're not aware of the impact that your actions and your changes can have to the users that are actually doing the work in Jira. So my rule of thumb, use it as a draft, use it to track and monitor progress on your timeline and update your timelines, but don't publish those changes unless you are absolutely sure you want those changes to be made in production in Jira. Now, with that, let's go ahead and look at what plans can actually do and the timeline view in plans can actually do. So here you can see we're currently under the basic view. What you can do is you can create different views. They have capacity view, top level view, dependencies, and then you can read some more about save views. We're just going to leave it as the basic view. Here you can also see that you can choose which fields you want to see for your timeline. So not only do we have those epics that were in our other plan, but we have different fields that we can display. This is incredibly helpful when you want to, let me go ahead and remove a couple of these. So we don't want progress. Status I like, due date, start date. Priority, I don't care about. But one of the things I do care about is assignee. The reason that I say assignee is an important field to view is because a lot of times when you're building out timeline and you're trying to understand the estimates, the other field that should be here is estimates. Now let's go ahead and go to view settings. Now let's go ahead, and because estimates is currently in days, I want to change that. So we're going to go to plan settings, and what we're going to do is under plan settings in estimation, you can choose to estimate by days or hours you think that's going to take, or story points. If you're a consulting firm, then hours might make sense when you're going and you're scoping work and you're building out a timeline where you can say, well, how many hours do we think the project kickoff is going to take us? And how many hours do we think requirements gathering and discovery is going to take us? And how many hours do we think configuration will take us and report building will take us? And so hours might be what you want to use, but it defaults to days. So make sure you go into plan settings and you either select hours or story points, depending on what it is you want to use. The other thing that you have to do here is it says inferred dates. So you can use sprint or release dates when issues don't have start dates. I don't like that. I'm going to select none because when it comes to my project plan and my project schedule, I just want to have the ability to control the start date and the stop dates and adapt those based on what is going on with my team, what's going on with the project, what's going on with the client, or what's going on with the organization, rather than being hindered by the parameters that the sprint dates or the release dates are setting. And so when you go and create a plan and a timeline within a plan, go ahead and select hours or story points under plan settings and make sure the inferred dates are selected to none. One thing I do want to call out here is story points as estimation will be grayed out if your project was set up as a Kanban project. In my opinion, this is an absolutely crucial feature that should never be grayed out or not given an option. So when your project is created, you are prompted to choose a Scrum project or a Kanban project. I recommend you always choose Scrum. And that's because even if your team works off of a Kanban board, if you create a Scrum project, you can then go and create a Kanban board to meet your team's needs and use quick filters to meet your team's needs as well. Whereas if you go and you create a Kanban project and then you create a Scrum board and you estimate your work with story points on that team, you will never be able to estimate using story points on your timeline. And that is just such a crucial feature that I think should never be grayed out. But it is what it is. There are limitations to Jira and Atlassian. I hope this is something that they address in the future and just make it available, whether you create a Scrum project or a Kanban project. But for the time being, I always recommend creating a Scrum project whenever you create a project. So, going back to our timeline. You've gone through project settings, you've updated estimation, you've updated the inferred dates to none. Let's go ahead and go back to our plan. Now that we're back to our plan, you'll see that the estimates is listed as story points, which is exactly what we wanted. The reason that I have these fields listed here So I have start date, due date, status, assignee, and story points. Is because when you are estimating work and scoping work for a timeline for your team, it's nice to say, okay, we have this project kickoff epic. Who's assigned to this epic? Who owns this epic? Or who owns the task underneath it, right? Who's assigned to that task? How many story points do we think that's going to be? Or how many hours do we think that's going to take? And you can enter it in this view. Now, what's really nice about that is you can then plug in your start date and your stop dates based on the hours and your team's capacity to build out your roadmap. And so here you have the epics, you have your start date, you have your due date, status, assignee, and story points. So this is currently the list view. We want to go to a timeline view. And so here you can see we have our epics, we have the fields, which have been collapsed, which is a very nice view if you don't want to show all those details and you're not doing an estimation with your team. So we have your epics and project milestones, you have your fields, and then you have your timeline with your dependency mapping as well. If you want to expand the fields, that collapses them even further. But if you wanted to expand them, you can show fields here, and then on the drop down, this is again where you can add assignee, and you can add story points, and you can add start date, and you can add due date. And here you can see these fields are here. Again, you can choose to collapse those fields and show the timeline after you've entered your information. Similarly to the other timeline, you can click and drag, or if you have the fields populated, you can go ahead and do start date of October 19th, and then we're going to do November 1st as the due date. And if you scroll over on your timeline, you can now see that this feature is scheduled to end on November 1st, so beginning November. Here at the bottom right, you can still see that you can change the view of your timeline. So if you want to do weeks, again, you can really see that that feature 2 is scheduled to end now on November 1st. And that's because we changed that with the start date and the due date here. So that's one way that you can control this project timeline. Again, make sure you toggle from list view to timeline view. You have the different views that you can have at the bottom, similar to the other ones. You have weeks, months, quarters, and years. You can minimize that if you do not want to see that. Here you can see unsaved changes because I made that change with the start date and the due date. On that one field, it says unsaved changes. So you can click into that button, and here is where it will ask you to save changes. When you hit save changes, it'll tell you what's changed. The due date and start date has changed. If you save those changes, not only will it send update notifications to team members, but it'll push those changes into Jira. And so again, if you changed assignee, if you changed story points, and you didn't want those changes to actually be reflected in Jira production, don't hit save changes. Your plan will be saved whether or not you hit that unsave changes button. In your plan, just make sure that if you actually go and hit unsave changes and then save those changes, you know that those changes will get pushed into Jira production. All right. So this is our view right now. The other thing that I really, really like about the plans timelines is that you can add filters. And by this is filters allows you to really narrow down exactly what it is that you're looking for. So hierarchy, if you want to do epics, let's say you don't care about seeing subtasks, right? Let's say you just wanted to stop on story. So you just want to see epics to stories. You can set that hierarchy. The other thing you can do is you can filter by releases or teams. You can filter by assignee. You can filter by sprints or projects. And so if you wanted to pull all projects, if you wanted to pull multiple projects, but you only want to show a couple, you could filter on that. You could filter by priorities. You can filter by issue types. And so this really does just give you the ability to narrow down exactly what you're looking for in a particular timeline. This is particularly helpful when you have one project that you're working on, but there are issues from other teams that have their own project in Jira that tie into your project, or you need to do dependency mapping. That means you want to include more than one project on this timeline, but you want to narrow down and filter exactly what projects you're going to filter for, right? So this just helps you narrow down and show you exactly what you want to look for without seeing everything under the sun. Again, I really do like that their plans portion, it does provide more functionality than just the timeline does. That ties into the board and the project. So that first timeline that we reviewed ties into the board, into the backlog under board configuration. But this plans view really just allows you to create multiple plans, maybe even for the same project. So you have schedule A, schedule B if something doesn't go to plan, and schedule C if things really don't go to plan, right? That's what's nice about plans. I do want you to be aware that there's both the timeline that's associated and tied to the board configuration and the backlog configuration. And then I want you to be aware that you can create multiple plans under that plans dropdown in the navigation bar in Jira. All right. That was a lot of information, but I hope this helps you get up and running with creating timelines for your projects, as well as being aware that you have just the basic timeline function that's tied to your board configuration, as well as the plans dropdown where you can create more elaborate and multiple timelines for any given project or multiple projects.